I invite each and every one of you to join the King Center for our 2023 King Holiday programs and experiences taking place from January 9th through the 16th. I'm excited now to share more about these programs and experiences with you. But I want to thank you all persistent in ensuring that this is a day that is set aside for us to kind of not just reflect and remember, but to kind of recalibrate, because Dr. King really gave us a vision of a world where we all could be treated with dignity, respect, and a way to do it, which is through nonviolence.
Justice is not reciprocating evil. We transcend evil without mirroring it. And that's what love does.
If we really believe, that in the golden rule, putting people first and understanding our power extends in the world, that we think of people, we will have different policies.
I sincerely believe that the teachings, the principles, and the strategies of the beloved community of Nonviolence 365 is life-changing, it's world-changing. It impacts the heart, the mind, the soul, the culture.
They began to see each other and to see themselves in one another. They began to see the commonality in their struggles. And when they all stood up for the smaller group, the Sikh temple, something transformed within the larger group in terms of a moment of acknowledging the shared humanity.
Throughout the evening, we will spotlight the unique stories of individuals and organizations doing positive and impactful work that moves us closer to creating the beloved community. Our first beloved community spotlight is evidence that you can help create the beloved community at any age.
Mrs. Coretta Scott King once said, "Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it, and you win it in every generation." So thank you to our courageous young people for fighting for equity and justice in our education system and creating the change needed today.
We are living in a time where our rights and freedoms are under attack. The legacy of the civil rights movement is more important now than ever. We must continue building coalitions and fighting for progress in building the beloved community.
Because we understand that to save our home planet requires active, nonviolent resistance to the evils of poverty, war, and racism.
You have an extraordinary purpose on this earth. And I want you to focus on that from this day forward, because our world is not going to get better unless you participate. We're waiting for many of you to get in line and do what God has placed in your heart to do to make this world a better place.
Well, it is important for us to get involved, because if we don't, then nothing's going to change.
Which means you have to take time for yourself, heal yourself, care for yourself, and most importantly, invest yourself in what matters most.
We get in our own bubbles doing our daily tasks, and if you don't get out there and see what other people are dealing with, how other people are living their lives, how are you to know what other people are going through?
We don't have to wait for another Martin Luther King Jr. or an elected official to do what needs to be done. You each have gifts and talents, and we need you to share that with the world.
And if we're going to do truth and justice work, what I'm telling you is that we cannot stop where we are. We cannot stay where we are. We're going to have to do some things. We're going to have to keep on keeping on. There's too much injustice in the world. We've got to keep on keeping on. There's too much inequality. We've got to keep on keeping on. There's too much poverty. We've got to keep on keeping on. There's too much hate. There's too much suffering. There's too much those who are trying to put people down. And that's what I mean when I say that we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things. That era of truth and justice that Dr. King was preaching about is an era that I believe we have to embrace and hold on to. And so what I want to say to you today is that while it is wonderful to be in this place, when we leave this place, I think we've got to find a way to become part of this movement, this beloved community that is preaching truth and justice. And what I want you to understand, when you hear the words beloved community, it may sound like a place of rest, but the beloved community is not a place of rest. It's a place of action.
But to live the true and comprehensive king is inconvenient, because he was not just spouting some words for our recitation and elucidation. His words carried prophetic mandates. He was God's prophet sent to this nation and even the world to guide us and forewarn us. When a prophet speaks, I want you to hear me. His words are not for our convenience or her words. They make a demand on us and are to our detriment and peril if we ignore them.
Welcome to our global audience. On behalf of Dr. Bernie C. King, CEO of the King Center, you are welcome to our beloved community talks. It's a series of courageous conversations that we host at the King Center. This is the first part of a three-part series on environmental justice with a focus on environmental racism in our world house. I'm Vanetta L. West, Chief Content Officer and Senior Nonviolence Trainer for the King Center. We were using some words as we were preparing to get started. I was sharing with some of our esteemed panelists for these two conversations today about how I'm excited to engage them and talk with them. And as we were preparing to come on and I was watching the video reflecting on our King Holiday Observance 2023, I thought about that word because we're so accustomed to talking about injustice and talking about racism. Some of us are. That the conversations just to be able to educate and to enlighten and then to advocate and then activate. We get so energized around those that I think for me in just a few moments, I was thinking about how we forget that these issues shouldn't even exist. That as human beings, we're living so far below our capacity, and absolutely racism is a reflection of, and injustice broadly is a reflection of how poorly we've treated each other as human beings, with particular attention in this topic to the perils and the blight of white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism across the globe. I want us to shift and begin to think about how these injustices shouldn't exist and how they're unacceptable. As we discuss environmental racism and environmental injustice in this conversation, in these two conversations today, let's consider what our world will look like if these issues, if racism, environmental racism, if indeed environmental injustice were not a thing, if we had a higher level of engagement. That is the vision of the King Center. The King Center's vision is, hence these beloved community talks, the beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. As we engage in these conversations, as you share this broadcast on Facebook, as you click copy on the YouTube version of this, on the YouTube stream, and share it. We want you to get this conversation out, these two conversations out. One, because we want to educate on what environmental racism is. Two, we want to engage everyone around the world in helping to create the beloved community. Three, we can't do that unless we know what an issue is, and then we talk about those action steps. We want to do all three of those things, focus on all three of those things in these two panel discussions that we'll have today. And so with that in mind, let's discuss for a moment, share for a moment about what environmental racism is, and then we'll bring on our first panel. Environmental racism, simply put, is when environmental situations disproportionately affect a group of people based on race. Historically, in this nation and across the world, The group of people that it has disproportionately impacted the most has been people of African descent, Black people, that we would now call ourselves in this nation, most of us, many of us. And so as we consider that, we want to also know that racism is one of the triple evils that Dr. King taught about. He taught about militarism or gross capitalism, materialism. He taught about militarism, capitalism / gross materialism. And then he also taught about poverty. Poverty also being gross materialism. So let me give you those again. Militarism, which we often phrase as war. Capitalism / kind of a gross materialism that pulls into or connects to poverty. All three of those words connecting together. And then racism, which today we see and we look at forms of discrimination that disproportionately impact people based on race. So as we talk about environmental racism, we're talking about racism specific to how the environment is formed, fashioned, what happens with our water in communities, what plants are placed in communities, what communities people are placed in based on race. So it's also when we encounter those biohazards, but it's including what's withheld from us that would cause us to be healthier in the environment. So we're going to get into all of that. We're going to go ahead and get started, though, with this first panel. So as we consider the triple evils, and then we go into specifically one of those evils, racism, and talk about environmental racism. This first panel that's joining us for this Beloved Community Talks will share more with us about specifically what's happening in Atlanta, where the King Center is located. And they are working, each of them, with some organizations. So we want to welcome the first panelist who's joining us for this panel one, part one of this environmental justice series. And this is a question: environmental racism, redlining, and the proposed Center for Public Safety, how are they interconnected? It's a question. Environmental racism, redlining, the public training facility, how are they interconnected? Yvette Carnell is the founder of ADOS. And when you see that acronym online, a lot of people give misinformation about what it's about. I just want to encourage you to go look up that organization, ADOS Advocacy Foundation, American Descendants of Slavery. I want you to go look that up and pay attention to who that organization says they are. She's the founder of the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. Before founding ADOS, she worked in politics for Senator Barbara Boxer and Congressman Marion Barry. She served as an assistant at the Women's Voter Center and as a regional field director for America's Families United. She also started a popular political call-in show on YouTube and co-founded the American Descendants of Slavery movement, and has made media appearances on CNN, ABC News, and other notable outlets. Yvette is from Decatur. They tell me that's where it's greater here in Metro Atlanta. And she holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Howard University. Welcome. We soon will welcome Yvette Carnell with the other panelists. We want to go to Dr. Jacqueline Eccles, the board president of the South River Watershed Alliance. She's an experienced environmental advocate with extensive experience serving as the board president of SRWA in Decatur for over a decade. At SWRA, she has supported community organizing and advocacy designed to give voice and raise community awareness concerning water pollution issues in underserved and urban communities within the city of Atlanta and DeKalb County. In the past, she served as a spokesperson for Atlanta's Clean Streams Task Force and as a member and chair of the Atlanta Tree Conservation Commission. She received her doctorate in political science from Clark Atlanta University. You will soon see and welcome Dr. Jacqueline Eccles. Gerald Griggs is president of the NAACP Georgia State Conference. He's an Atlanta attorney studying at Oxford College of Emory University. He received his BA in 2000 at Emory And then he received his JD in 2004 from the University of Cincinnati College of Law. He is the first vice president of the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP and the former third vice president of vice president chair of the Georgia NAACP. Attorney Griggs formerly served in numerous capacities for the state conference of the Georgia NAACP, including the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee and the field director of district coordinators. Further, Attorney Griggs has worked in partnership with the SCLC, 100 Black Men of Atlanta, Emerging 100, ACLU, the Urban League Young Professionals, and numerous community groups that are committed to improving the community. We will welcome and see in just a moment Gerald Griggs. And then rounding out our panel, our first panel for this Beloved Community Talks two-panel conversation today is King Williams, who is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, podcast host, and author based in Atlanta. He has extensive knowledge of the history of redlining and gentrification in Atlanta. Please join me in welcoming our four great panelists, conversationalists for this first conversation today. Gerald Griggs, welcome. Dr. Jacqueline Eccles, welcome. Thank you for joining us. King Williams, welcome. And Yvette Carnell, welcome. Thank you so much. I just saw you and it's just good to see you again. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. I want to give each of you 1 to 2 minutes, starting with Yvette, to share about yourself, anything that we didn't share. If you want to share more about your organization and what you do.
Sure. Welcome. Thank you so much. And once again, thank you for having us. I'm so appreciative to be here with the King Center and the work that they have been doing, that you have been doing. I want to thank you first and foremost. The ADOS Advocacy Foundation stands for American Descendants of Slavery, and it started out of a wealth conversation where we looked at the inherent disparities of our specific community that derive all the way from slavery. And we had that discussion and decided that reparations had to happen, that had to be on the table. But we also have a transformative Black agenda that seeks to remove us as a racialized bottom caste in this country. And so that's what we're working for. We have chapters that are launching nationwide this summer. And so I look forward to working with you and everybody on this panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome again. Dr. Eccles.
Thank you. I've been working on water issues in DeKalb County in the city of Atlanta, as you mentioned earlier, for 25 years. For the past 12 years, while I've been the board president for South River Watershed Alliance, I've been specifically focused on issues in South DeKalb County, and actually the corridor that extends from South Atlanta to Southeast Atlanta to South DeKalb County, because that particular corridor, to this day, the people of color make up 85% of the population that lives in that area. And there are some very dynamic and dramatic issues that are going on in that area that bears mentioning. I think that really does highlight how this issue of environmental racism seemingly has just taken on a new life within the last 12 years.
Apologize. Thank you, Dr. Eccles. Welcome. Brother Griggs.
Yes, and thank you. I'm Attorney Gerald Griggs, and it's an honor to be on this panel with so many great individuals that give back to our community. But I'm Attorney Gerald Griggs, president of the Georgia State Conference, and I'm a native Atlantan, born and raised in Southwest Atlanta, grew up mainly in Decatur. Been a civil rights attorney for almost 20 years now, been in the NAACP for almost a decade. And it's just an honor to be on this panel, to have this conversation, a much needed conversation, not only about the environmental racism and issues in Atlanta, but broadly for the nation and the world. So I look forward to engaging.
Welcome. Thank you. King.
Thank you to everyone at the King Center for allowing me to be a part of this. I am King Williams. I am a journalist and a documentary filmmaker here in Atlanta. I have recently started to cover some of the issues that's going on with South DeKalb and some of their issues related to health and wellness in that community. I'm also a native of Atlanta, and I apologize in advance. I'm recovering over a little bit of an illness, so I hope you all can hear me clearly.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Again, welcome to each of you. I just want to jump right in because I know I gave a very abbreviated definition for environmental racism. I want the audience to hear from each of you because somebody may be asking, what's the big deal? As always, when we as the King Center post about racism, people respond with racism doesn't exist anymore. Some of that I think is just folks pretending. And then often I believe that there's a contingent of people in our world house who don't understand what racism is and don't understand how it's showing up and how it's harming people across the globe, with specific attention in this conversation to Black people, Indigenous people, brown people, especially in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta. Can you share what environmental racism is and how you're seeing it show up specifically in Atlanta? We'll start with you, Dr. Eccles.
Sure, we'd love to. A lot of people confuse or just look at it as the same thing: environmental justice and environmental racism. Yeah, environmental justice is the generic right to a safe and healthy environment. So, I mean, that's just generally how it applies to all people. Environmental racism, on the other hand, environmental racism is a race-based discrimination in policymaking, enforcement of laws and regulations, and communities of color, and citing communities of color for toxic and polluting industries, resulting in disproportionate harm. So that makes it very specific and very targeted when you look at those three buckets. And these days in Atlanta, particularly with the whole Cop City issue, and I can talk about even South DeKalb County as it relates to their 2010 consent decree. I mean, we are talking about policy making because we're talking about a consent decree. We're talking about a conscious decision to build that police facility where they're building it, and they couldn't build it anywhere else. Enforcement of regulations. We've identified violations of the Clean Water Act associated with that particular facility that DeKalb County is ignoring, state Georgia EPD is ignoring. So there is that lack of enforcement of regulation and laws. And the siting of the facility itself, the polluting industry, and we've talked at nauseum about the impacts on the environment, the impacts on the community, as it relates to climate change and mental health and general well-being and wealth displacement, just all of that. So that will cause disproportionate harm. It's not happening to anybody else. So if it's happening to these folks, it's disproportionate, and as I say, this wouldn't be happening anywhere else in Atlanta for a number of reasons, but it's being allowed to take place and is defended by folks, from the mayor, to the city council, the folks in DeKalb, the leadership in DeKalb County. And for me, that is the epitome of environmental racism. It fits all of the buckets of how that concept is manifested on an everyday basis. It fits.
Thank you. Gerald, before you share, I wanted to highlight that, Dr. Eccles, what you just shared reminded me of a Jane Elliott video where she asked white people, a room of white people, she says, stand if you want to be treated the way that Black people are treated in this country. And nobody stands because there is some awareness that there's a disproportionate harm, some of it very intentional, majority of it, I would say, in my research, toward Black people in this nation and people of African descent around the world. Yeah. Gerald, from your perspective, what is environmental racism and injustice looking like in Atlanta?
I think that environmental racism is an intersectional conversation of oppression. And so as the NAACP, we've been dealing with this for 114 years. But I think what it looks like is landfills disproportionately built in Black communities. It's water pollution disproportionately happening in Black communities. It's policymakers that are redlining for a community to make sure that certain people only live in a certain area. And so I think that it's an intersection of policy oppression that we have to deal with, and we have to name it. And so I think that Dr. Eccles has done an exceptional job talking about what's happening currently in South DeKalb County, but we see this manifested all over the state of Georgia. It's just particular that we're focused on Atlanta. If we focus on what's happening in Vine City with the building of the retention pond, with all of the water issues there, you see it there. And I think most people in the World House would understand it as what happened in Flint or what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi. But all those things are happening in Atlanta, and the microcosm of it is what's happening at the South River. So what I would determine is the intersection of environmental racism is the housing conditions, it's the living conditions, and it's the oppression that continue to put us in situations where we have to worry about our health, we have to worry about water, we have to worry about all those structural needs that you need to survive, and then place racism on top of it.
King, how does redlining connect to all of this? When we think about mental health, physical health, economic health, and redlining as it pertains to environmental racism, what's your perspective, your thought?
When it comes
on
to
the connection
Atlanta,
between redlining and housing and what we're seeing?
yeah, so I think that's really on two folds. On the city of Atlanta side of it, we look at historically the place that were redlined in the city of Atlanta, or a place that also would eventually become the place that would be the most polluted in the city of Atlanta, whether that be through our zoning for our illegal and legal dumps, and also just for construction and demolition of certain facilities and certain buildings in those spaces. But when we go out on a macro level, we look more at the metro area, and a place like DeKalb County is very interesting because you see this secondhand redlining in the sense that real estate, in terms of steering Black residents to certain parts of the county, i.e. most Black residents live on the southern end of DeKalb County and not necessarily the northern end. And also the place where a lot of these businesses are getting the permits and the zoning to continue to pollute in that area, whether it be through the water, through the soil, or through the air, are also in those same residential areas. And so we see more and more businesses and more individual Black homeowners in this year, including 2023, still being steered toward these areas that have some serious environmental issues, while their white, Asian, or Latino counterparts are being persuaded to live somewhere else within the same county.
Thank you. Yvette, sometimes we'll mention this video of Dr. King at the end. We'll share it on social media as the King Center, or Dr. Bernie C. King will share it at the end of this video where he's talking about land distribution for Europeans that didn't happen for Black people in this nation. He concludes by saying, we're coming to get our check. And I know often, I'm going to wait for Yvette to come back in, but I'll finish the question. Often people will say Dr. King wouldn't talk about reparations. But we found in our study of Dr. King that what he understood is there had to be some repairing, especially economically. And so as we're bringing Yvette back on, I want to open that question up to each of you. How does environmental racism necessitate there being some economic repair and some mental health repair and some physical health repair, as we consider, as Randall Robinson called it, the debt? How does environmental racism necessitate repair, which reparations is repairing, bringing some restoration, whether that's financial, physical, mental, education, or otherwise? I'll open up that question first to you, King. When you consider that, how does what you're seeing with redlining and environmental racism and other manifestations cause us to think we do need to repair some things? There does need to be some type of restitution, debt paid to Black people in this nation, with attention to, as Ado says, the descendants of slavery.
Yeah, I think when it comes to both restoration and directly reparations, when it comes to a place like Atlanta in particular, we have a couple of fronts that we can look at on. One of which, when it comes to reparations, is both just obviously financial compensation for that. The other one is also restoration of communities. And so the other one too, we want to look at also is repair in those spaces. And so when we talk about the city of Atlanta, a city that's lost the majority of its poor Black population over the last 20 years due to gentrification and redevelopment and things like that, and then the places like South DeKalb, which had a large Black middle class, which are now feeling the effects of these zoning policies in particular, they have two different forms of what we need to consider what reparations look like, right? Because the people in South DeKalb, maybe those people who are homeowners, if there is going to be a reparations framework for that, maybe their reparations are going to be about restoring the land that's physically there with a lot of the environmental issues, but maybe those people leave as well, and they might need some financial help or compensation to alleviate some of the potential loss in property value as they have to sell their home or move to another location. And in the case of places like the city of Atlanta, where our poorest populations are moving or being moved around, what reparation looks like for poor people would actually look very different, because this is going to be either addressing the lack of services and the lack of care related to those people, and then also how does that care look over 10, 15, and 20 years in terms of structure, and bring these people from poorer means to middle class and wealthier means.
Thank you for that. Dr. Eccles, in your work with helping to rid our communities of pollution and ensuring that there is environmental equity, justice, what would a repairing look like to you?
King mentioned a really good point about how reparations will look different in different communities, based, just on history and income, for instance. When we look at what local government does today, not just from a historical standpoint, just say we're just standing at a moment in time and we want to change. We want to make a change here. We want to do something different for impacted Black communities. The main way that local governments invest in communities is through investments in parks and green space. If you want to try to turn a community around, the first, just put a park there, put money behind it, and improve the community from the environment out. It matters. When we look at wastewater infrastructure, as is going on in DeKalb County, wastewater infrastructure is critical just for community health, for environmental health, for public health. And to be in a situation where you have the opportunity to fix the wastewater system in DeKalb County, in South DeKalb County, through this consent decree, as you would in North DeKalb County, but you leave out South DeKalb County, that opportunity to invest in that community just through something as basic as wastewater infrastructure is critical. I mean, that's a start, because you can't have a healthy community when you have sewage spilling out in the community every time that it rains. When you look at this whole issue with Cobb City, that was a park. It was designated a park in 2017. It was 300 acres. It was the largest park, public green space inside of 285. I mean, that was huge for that community to have that kind of investment. And for the city of Atlanta, this turned around, a couple of 3 years later, and because they wanted to do something else and disinvest. So your investments turn to disinvestment just that quickly. And you're offering nothing. You can't really replace it. So it's not that I don't think these municipalities see what's going on. The question becomes at this point, I think, given the importance of the role of government, how, what is needed to improve Black and Brown communities is to have this knowledge and do nothing. So, yeah, I mean, we aren't really talking about historic reparations, but if you just take a community where it is now and start to improve it, we're even, dismissing opportunities
in a present day kind of environment, not historically. So, I mean, I think that's something that we should really focus on. I know that's what we are in terms of South River Watershed Alliance, in terms of how to deal with this issue. It's take advantage of those opportunities to improve Black communities and move the pendulum forward now with what we've got, rather than going backwards.
Thank you for that. That we'll come back to that. Something that you raised in a moment, Dr. Eccles, because what you mentioned is not just inflicting harm, but withholding help. Because when you talk about taking a park away, that means that environmental racism and injustice is not only we're going to put you in a place where there's hazardous material, or we're going to bring hazardous material once you live there. It's also when the things that help you are taken away.
Yes.
That's also disproportionate harm. So we have to think about that, audience. What does this look like? And as you read in the news about what's happening, if you don't live in Atlanta, with the construction of this public safety training center, which is also called by many who are protesting it, Cop City. What's really being protested? What's the concern? We want to always encourage you. Don't just believe the little things you hear. Go look it up. Do your research so you're aware of what's happening. What will happen with the construction of this facility for the communities that live in proximity to this facility? What's already in that community? How has that space been helping? How could it help more? What will happen if that space is changed, altered, or removed? We'll come back to that in a moment. Yvette, you tried to make me sweat because as soon as I was asking this question about reparations, you just disappeared. Now you're back. But how does environmental racism necessitate reparations?
Well, let me just first, before we talk about this, I think this will help answer the question, just give some historical context, right? So, normally when we talk about reparations or what the lineage of coming from slavery means, we just view that as one specific policy. But even when we talk about environmental racism, what you're talking about really is a kind of social order, right? Because we ourselves were viewed as pollutants. We ourselves, in terms of, we were viewed as contagion. So we couldn't buy a house. And if we bought a house in a white neighborhood, you're a contagion to wealth. You're going to bring the value down. So what happens is if we as a group are considered pollutants and contaminants and contagions, it makes sense based on that social order that you would dump in our neighborhood, that you would put factories in our neighborhoods that kill us, that you would put other contaminants alongside people who you view as contaminants and have viewed as contaminants since we got here, right? So I view environmental racism as just another form of racism in terms of maintaining a social order where everyone else gets to get the good things that come out of the factories and the good things that come out of dumping something elsewhere. I get clean water, so you have to drink dirty water. You drinking the dirty water is how I drink the clean water, because somebody in this country has to eat and drink that failure. And that has historically been our group when we talk about American descendants of slavery. So I just like to expand it out so we can think of it that way. When we talk about reparations, we're not trying to in any way exclude environmental racism. What we're also talking about is a way to kind of deconstruct a social order that has relentlessly and unmercifully placed us at the bottom for generations.
Thank you so much. All of this we talking about, we got some states that don't want us to talk about this right now. We got to have our own conversation, right? Which is probably key and essential for our children, for our communities, that we start to elevate our education of each other on all of these platforms that we have. Gerald, did you have something you wanted to share as we think about? I want everybody who's viewing this right now to share this broadcast, share quotes that you're hearing. We will also put up this evening some links to more information about environmental racism. But considering what Yvette just shared, Dr. Eccles and King shared, and then that why wouldn't they put more pollutants in communities where they place people who are considered in the social order to be pollutants? What is repairing look like in Atlanta? Jerry, you're muted. I just want to.
Sorry about that. I've thought
Thank
long
you.
and hard about this, and I must give credit to Yvette and others who have elevated this conversation completely into mainstream society. But repair for Georgia, repair for Atlanta, I believe fits in 3 buckets. One would be direct cash payment to descendants of African chattel slavery. 2 would be land repair, meaning giving us the 40 acres and a mule that were guaranteed. And then 3 would be economic investment in our educational system to lift those that have been disproportionately marginalized up to the ability to not just survive, but to thrive. And so I think when we have this conversation of environmental racism, we can't just look at it through that lens of environmental racism. It is, in fact, racism that is permeating our environment and going everywhere. And so I think we need to deal with those 3 buckets. I know that Fulton County has a task force. I'm not sure if DeKalb County has a task force. I know Atlanta does not have a task force to carry this conversation. I think the conversation that has started in California needs to come to Georgia, and we need to come up with a number, but not just a number. Like I said, we need land, and we need to truly invest in our educational system to even get to where we can say that Atlanta has been repaired, that Georgia has been repaired, and that the individuals who suffered on this land, whose descendants suffered on this land, are made whole. So I think that that's where we begin that conversation. I like what Dr. Eccles has said. I like what Yvette Carnell has said. I haven't heard a lot from King on this subject, but I think that's where we start.
Yeah, I was mentioning before we got started, thank you, Gerald, about ghetto housing. And one of the questions we wanted to ask of this panel is the decreased lifespan of Black people in this nation, and in fact, globally. As we look at that, and these barriers that are placed in the way of health and wholeness, even mental health, think about the impact of environmental racism period on mental health. What are some of the things that you found to be solutions? Like, what if you had to just tell people one thing that they could start right now? And I mean, whether it's research, education, looking into a task force, what is it in Atlanta that you believe we should be doing to address environmental racism right now? King, I'll start with you.
In the case of Atlanta, it really is about what is the fast way to get both funds to state level administration and then what also to local administration. I mean both, because in a lot of ways, sometimes you're going to have to use either state and local laws or circumvent state and local laws. And you need a funding mechanism that's faster to make those things happen and happen relatively quickly. So I think that would be one of the first things I would think about. And I want to leave the door open for Dr. Eccles to kind of take this one home.
Well, being that I've spent the last 25 years working on water issues in Southeast Atlanta, South DeKalb County, it's been interesting trying to identify ways to improve water quality. I mean, because that's a big part of the pollution issues on the southeast, south side of town, South DeKalb County, are focused on the South River, where it's been going on for a really long time. And the interesting thing is that the only way to improve water quality in Georgia, the most efficient way through Georgia EPD, who's never done anything great or meaningful to protect the South River, is use. And that's one thing that typically among Black people who may not swim as learn to swim or have the opportunity to learn to swim or recreate on water as much as white people. and just having a lack of contact with the river, even in the upper parts of the city, that it's the lack of recreation. And Georgia EPD is responsible for implementing the Clean Water Act. So this is important. So, over the decades, since there's been no recreational activity on the river until, we started our river paddles in the last 12 years, that was reason not to improve water quality. So it didn't matter about the sanitary sewer spills. It didn't matter about the combined sewer spills in the city of Atlanta and the lack of progress on improving their wastewater system, which disproportionately affects Black communities. So it's interesting how these regulatory issues, when you start to look at how do you improve things, are just as important as it is a policy issue. I mean, it's a very real policy issue. So, and as my mantra has always been, as the environment goes, so goes the community, that if you're going to improve it, the environment is the best place to start and work it outwards in an effort to ensure that you don't end up with displacement of the community, where you don't end up with gentrification. So it's get folks involved on an environmental, from an environmental standpoint, and work your way out to improve the community as a whole. And I do believe that there are models out there that support. I know I worked quickly for Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina, and the president there did an amazing job of turning the community around by constructing a very efficient and effective community development corporation that improved the community, built housing, sold them to community residents, and didn't displace the folks who were already there. So, there are ways. Focusing on the environment first and then expanding outward.
Thank you. Did you have something you wanted to share right after that, Yvette?
Well, I just wanted to make one quick point too, because I think Jacqueline made so many good points there. In terms of, I don't think we focus enough in terms of the conversations that we have, not in terms of anybody specifically on this panel, about what the EPA does not do in terms of enforcement, in terms of compliance, in terms of not referring cases over to the Department of Justice for prosecution. These are all levers, of power that should be leveraged on behalf of our community when they are dealing with environmental racism. And I think sometimes that we don't talk about that. We should absolutely protest when people are hurt or murdered by police or by a racist. We should do that. We should protest. That was part of Dr. King's. We're going to do nonviolent protest. Nonviolent protest is something that we should engage in. But we should also find a way to protest when we are killed en masse because the government doesn't enforce its own rules and regulations. And I think we have to find a way to normalize that in our community and react to that, because it's killing us slowly. And sometimes we just don't react to things that are killing us slowly as we do when things kill us fast, right? And that's a problem.
Wow. I want to, both of what you just said as we wrap up this panel, I think that's so important, because we do see oftentimes that there's when a person, an individual is killed, and of course we know there are repeat offenses concerning, in particular, police brutality and other forms of violence, but these are cases of Wilson and with Flint and with Louisiana and Cancer Alley and with what we see happening here in Metro Atlanta, where if we don't change this and turn the tide, you're talking about harm to thousands and then millions of people. And why isn't that often something that we look at and say, hey, Department of Justice, let's take a look at this. Let's do something about this. I think that's a great call to action. Gerald, do you have a closing comment or anything you want to share with us?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with both Dr. Echols and Yvette Cornell that we have to have a strong response, not just to the police encounters. I know I've been guilty of that. We have strong response with the marches and the protests, but we need to make sure we hold our elected officials accountable. And this is an elected official issue with policy making. So in the city of Atlanta, we can hold the county commission responsible in Fulton County or DeKalb County, or the city council directly responsible for this lack of action, this lack of crafting policy to address these issues. And we can always hold the DOJ in the Northern District accountable for not prosecuting cases when you have violations of the law that are clear that deal with environmental issues. So I think that that's the call to action, to hold these policymakers and to hold the legislators accountable for when these things happen. And, you know, at the NAACP, we will do that. We have done that. We will continue to do that. But what I want to impress upon people is that as we have this conversation, let's move this conversation from just conversation to action. We need to hold people accountable so we don't have an issue at the South River, which is going to be exacerbated by Cop City, or we don't have an issue in Vine City, which is being exacerbated by the gentrification and the building. So I think that the next step is to hold our elected officials accountable and hold the bureaucrats accountable who are charged with enforcing the law and making sure the lawbreakers are held accountable.
Well, we have another panel, and we have 2 more parts to this series. And I want to circle back to all of you eventually to talk about some of these action steps, and definitely want to continue, the King Center does, to engage you on social media platforms. I think there's a lot more education to be done, Gerald, Yvette, King, and Dr. Eccles, in our spaces that we share. And we hope that you're open to doing that with us, because this is wow, just what you shared in this conversation, I think it helps us to understand what the problem is. And as always, what we want to do at the King Center, because we get pushback from people who say, oh, Dr. King wouldn't talk about that. Dr. King would talk about those things that harm humanity. And he was talking about always things that harm Black people. And this is an issue that should be of great concern to all of us. And I thank you for your work, for the work you do every day, not just for being here on this panel, but I know I've seen it in Dr. Eccles' face, talking to her one-on-one in person, that the energy, what it takes for you to do this and to talk about it even, but to go out day in and day out and push for justice for descendants of chattel slavery, Yvette, and for King, you to be talking about redlining and the things that are harmful to Black communities on a daily basis. And you, Gerald, you know, to be leading the NAACP in Georgia. And I always see you out standing with some family who's going through something horrible. Dr. Eccles, I see you on the river. Each of you, you're doing critical work, and we are so grateful and look forward to, in upcoming panel discussions, having you join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This conversation continues right after this break. We have some videos we want to share with you. When we come back, panel 2 will join us as we talk about what the federal response should be to environmental injustice. Welcome back. Thank you to all of you who are joining us across the globe. We're grateful for our global audience. We want to bring on our second panel. Before we do that, I just want to encourage everyone who's tuning in right now to share this broadcast, to invite people. If you're tuning in on Facebook, joining us on Facebook, to tag 5 to 10 people, to host a watch party. This is a courageous conversation. Where in the world are we talking about the impact, the intentional harm caused by environmental racism, and talking about it in a way that encourages action. And we of course are going to invite you to engage the philosophy of nonviolence in addressing this critical issue, this injustice that's harming people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, brown people, all across the world, and specifically in the United States. So we see thanks coming in from different people for us hosting this conversation. You're welcome. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining. Our second panel that we have joining us, we'll talk about repairing the breach. How is the federal government addressing systemic environmental injustices? Repairing the breach. What do? We have, as our last panel shared, government agencies and departments in place that can help. We have people within those departments and those agencies who want to help and want to do the work and may be encountering barriers in what they want to do. How can we work together, and how can we lean on and call on and be a part of our federal agencies intervening and preventing some of the environmental injustices that we're seeing? Our first panelist joining us for this discussion is Marion Engelman Lotto. Marion Engelman Lotto is Acting Principal, Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency. And she works with the newly launched Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. They had to get somebody on it. That's Marion. She joined the EPA in February 2021 as Deputy General Counsel of Environmental Initiatives, and previously directed an environmental justice clinic at Vermont Law School and served as lecturer at both the Yale University School of Public Health and the Yale School of the Environment. Before clinical teaching, Marion served as a senior staff attorney at Earth Justice and as general counsel at New York Lawyers for Public Interest, and began her legal career at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF. She holds a BA in government from Cornell University, a JD from the University of California at Berkeley, and an MA in politics from Princeton University. We'll see in a moment, but we want to go ahead and welcome Marion Engelman Lotto. We also have joining us Dr. Tony Reams, who is Deputy Director of Energy Justice, Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis, Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. He leads the department's new Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. Dr. Reams was most recently an associate professor too, maybe, of environment and sustainability at the University of Michigan, where he established the Urban Energy Justice Lab and Energy Equity Project, focusing on research and solutions to the production and persistence of racial, income, and geographic energy-related disparities. He earned a BS in civil engineering from North Carolina A&T State University, a Master of Engineering Management from Kansas State University, and a PhD in Public Administration from the University of Kansas. Welcome, Dr. Reams. We'll see him in just a moment. And also on this panel, Brandy Richard Thompson, the Public Affairs Officer for FEMA Region 9. He's the founder of Operation Growth Institute, a global transformational learning center where people can accept, heal, grow, and transform into the next iteration of their personal and professional best. For over 20 years, Brandy has honed her skills as a strategist, wellness expert, and coach. She examines how the barriers, of generational baggage, fatherlessness, sexual trauma, single mother fatherhood, racial identity and bias, and failure keep her clients from living their best life, and helps her clients determine the next step. She is also a certified holistic health counselor by the International Board of African Thinkers, Priests and Healers, a certified fatherless daughters advocate, and a student of the MMS coaching method. Brandy has studied with the Aspen Institute, Kellogg Foundation, the Zuckerberg Institute, Ayanna Van Zant and the God Squad, Queen Afua, and Dr. Lalela Africa. Welcome, Brandy Richard Thompson. We'll have all of our panelists for this discussion join us now as we talk about repairing the breach. How is the federal government addressing systemic environmental injustice? Welcome. Welcome, Brandy. Welcome, Dr. Rames. Welcome, Mary.
Hi.
Hi. That first conversation, do you have thoughts about that first conversation? I learned so much. Based on what I just read about each of you, you probably didn't learn potentially some of those things that I heard for the first time. But as we talk about repairing the breach, how do we connect the dots to this conversation from the last conversation? What are the sentiments or the thoughts, the comments that are lingering with you? Dr. Reams, you're muted, so you're aware if you wanted to share. Marion, what's lingering with you from what was shared in the first panel?
Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you. It's a total honor to be here and to participate in this conversation. And I learned a lot.
You're welcome. And also, as you get started, I want you to share for 1 to 2 minutes about yourself. I apologize. You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, I want to start by saying I learned a lot. It was really helpful and interesting to frame this panel by listening to what was happening in Atlanta, for example. As you said, I started my career in civil rights, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and just have had the opportunity. I was there at the beginning of the formal environmental justice movement in the 80s and 90s, and just had the opportunity and the honor of working with communities around this country. And that's what I bring to the administration. This just seemed like I heard the comment about how much more we have to do. And I think, we know that. We know we have to do a lot more as the federal government. So I welcome those comments. I welcome the action. I think we have to be held accountable. I'm excited to be in the administration precisely because it is a transformative moment. Here's how I connect what we heard with and the issues of environmental racism and justice with where we are today. Fundamentally, race, color, national origin, income, and zip code are predictors of a person's likelihood of living near polluting sources and being exposed to pollution. But that's not a surprise. The United States developed as a deeply segregated society through policies of racial segregation, redlining, and other discriminatory practices. And the vestiges, here's the point, the vestiges of these policies on land use have never been uprooted. So I started my career doing work in education. And although the promise of equal education remains illusory, we have wrestled with the responsibility to address the vestiges of our history in the field of education. In the 1972, in a Supreme Court case, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, the Supreme Court ruled that school authorities had the obligation to eliminate the vestiges of state-imposed segregation, root and branch, right? We have never had that kind of Supreme Court case, had that kind of obligation in the area of land use. So if, for example, areas where communities of color resided were deemed industrial and polluting sources clustered nearby, there was no Supreme Court case that demanded that zoning lines be redrawn to address racial inequality. So as a result, race, color, and national origin, a person's racial or ethnic background, it's not surprising that it's a predictor of exposure to pollutants such as PM 2.5, what gets into our respiratory system. And in fact, research is showing, there's a body of research now, 17 new research studies in the last few years that look at redlining and then look at pollution like PM 2.5 and find a relationship between that redlining and pollution today. So we know there's a direct relationship, and we need to, as you say, repair the breach. And I hope we have time to talk about some of what we're doing just focused on that.
Absolutely, particularly as it relates to Marion, what the EPA is doing with dumping in Black communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. There are a number of things. But Dr. Reams, just a little bit that you want to share, and then how do you connect the last conversation to how repairing the breach?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. West and the King Center, for the invitation to be here today, and super excited for the conversation with the panelists today. I come to the administration from doing a decade of research looking at disparities in our energy system, particularly focus on race, class, and place, realizing we're in an extraordinary moment. And I started this work during our last extraordinary moment during the economic recession of the late 2000s when President Obama was in office, and we had historic investments in our energy system, unlike we had ever seen. But I recognized that if we don't design our policies and programs in a way that direct those dollars to the communities that need it the most, it wouldn't go to those communities. And so I'm currently the second person to hold this title of Deputy Director for Energy Justice, which is brand new in the Biden administration, but recognizes Secretary Granholm's commitment to justice, the Secretary of Energy. And so she wanted a senior official to have energy justice in the title, to say that justice and equity are our North Star. And so we also created a brand new office of energy justice policy and analysis to make policy recommendations that focus on communities of color, minority-owned businesses, that they participate in this windfall of resources that we have to bring about a clean energy transition, but then also to do what Mariam was talking about, the research to show that disparities exist and whether the decisions and program designs that we're putting in place are having a positive or negative impact. And so I built a team of researchers and policy analysts who are looking at communities, places that have challenges that are bearing the brunt of our energy system, whether it's coal plants, whether it's dumping, and thinking about, again, how we eradicate those disparities, but then how do we ensure people participate? And what I heard from the panelists just before us was this accountability mechanism. And I like to say the data that you don't have is the problem you can't see. And so we need data to be able to make the policy recommendations, to show colleagues across the federal government that issues exist, even if you think about them anecdotally, but we have research to show they exist. And we have to evaluate our programs to make sure we're eradicating them.
Wow. Brandy, you seem to be, I was reading your bio, I want to make an appointment. Just as I was reading about this holistic health component, as you share more about yourself, could you also connect for us when we talk about environmental justice, the trauma that it causes, as after your introduction and whatever you'd like to share?
Thank you so much, Dr. West, and I am
welcome. Thank you. Welcome to each of you.
I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be here. One of the things that I think is important about my background is that I'm a child of Southern Louisiana in that Cancer Alley that was talked about in this past conversation. Also a child of two individuals who were pioneers in the government and did amazing work within the Social Security Administration, sister to people who are in government service. And so I understand the power of that service to be able to innovate and execute from the inside of an agency against these policies that are put in place and provide context and information to individuals who are making these decisions on the ground level to actually get things done. I also have a National Urban League background and served as the national president for the Urban League and got extremely involved in advocacy. In fact, a lot of the people that I see in the administration now and people who are leading in some of these environmental justice areas are individuals who started in that advocacy space and have branched out and become real leaders to help us to address these challenges. But what I've seen through that work, whether it was in the government or through being a product of the South, or through my advocacy work, was that it was the iteration that we can make with individual people that helped us to really facilitate and create change. And so I appreciate the coaching background and the information that you all shared about me, because I use that not only inside of the agency to help leaders and individuals to think differently about the work that we're doing, to help them to be more successful at executing for the American people. But I'm also able to better understand how our work actually impacts the people that we serve and their emotion and traumatic response as a result of the work that we are tasked with doing. When disasters happen, people are just in a really traumatic state. And so one of the things that I want to share is when I started at the agency, I started after Hurricane Katrina, specifically because I wanted to help people who were impacted in Louisiana, where I was from. 18 years later, I'm still with the agency. But in 2022, there were 18 disasters that were responsible for more than $1 billion in losses across the United States. And while that's a huge number for all of us to kind of wrap our brain around, those are individuals whose homes are and their lives are upended when a disaster happens. And sometimes they are being impacted over and over again in the same places. And so some of the work that we're doing at FEMA with creating hazard mitigation, grant opportunities, building resilient infrastructure for community grant opportunities are allowing funds to go to communities to help them to harden and not have to go over and through the same disasters that they have. Well, they've got to go through the same disasters, but actually have their homes and their infrastructures hardened to the point where they can be able to deal with those challenges a little bit better. So I'm really excited for this conversation and thankful for the invitation.
Thank you so much. How are your organizations doing the work? Marion, you mentioned you really want to dig into the things we can do to prevent. And as Brandy, as you were sharing, I started thinking about how we can, I don't want to say that agencies aren't a part of we the people, because we're all a part of the people. It's almost like when people say law enforcement and community needs to get along or find a pathway to change our relationships with each other. I think to myself, but we are each other. You know, we are community. Maybe if that shifts, how do federal agencies meet people? Like, how can people kind of push and there'll be a groundswell where we connect with federal agencies to get some of the work done? Is there a way that people can encourage the Department of Energy, the EPA, FEMA, in the work? And I by no means, audience, I'm not saying we need to make agencies do what they're supposed to do. I mean, how can we engage each other as we look at dumping in communities of color, redlining, the different things that we're seeing with environmental injustice? How can we connect with agencies to get the work done? I'll start with you, Marion.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are so many opportunities right now to engage with the federal government. There are listening sessions. There are opportunities for notice and comment. The reason I'm sort of pausing before answering is we know that people have a lot to do. And while we want people to engage, we also understand people can't get involved in everything. So organizations can help out, residents can help out. There are just so many ways. At EPA, we have headquarters, we have our regional offices. They're involved in outreach and listening sessions and hearings. We've had hearings, for example, in more than 20 communities around ethylene oxide, where there are concerns about ethylene oxide. But you could PFAS, lead, ethylene oxide. It's just so much, and we want people to be engaged. We want to hear from people, but we also recognize it's so much, and it's also important to be involved at the local and state level. Many states around the country right now have formed environmental or climate justice advisory groups. And it's critical that people get involved in that. Or we have the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and now the WEJEC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And we have at EPA monthly community engagement calls. We have one coming up next week. And people can go to epa.gov and sign up to get notices. So I'm mentioning because there are just so many ways that are organized to get people involved. But I think the message I want to say or to leave you with is that it is really important, whatever way fits for any person or any community. It is just so important to hold us accountable. Our work stands on the shoulders of those who came before us, both inside and outside of the federal government. We stand on the shoulders of those in the civil rights movement, those in the farm worker justice movement, in the indigenous rights movement, those in Warren County in the 1980s who stood up for justice by laying their lives down on the pavement to stop trucks from bringing PCB-laden earth into a landfill in their community. And they went to jail each night. They sang in jail using traditional civil rights mechanisms, methods, approaches, and children and parents led that movement. And in their seminal report, which followed the protests, the United Church of Christ released Toxic Waste and Race, which followed these protests. And they called on the government to develop an environmental justice advisory group. And you know what? We have one, the NEJAC. They called on the federal government to issue an environmental justice executive order. And you know what? We have one. And to do a range of things that came to pass. And they came to pass because people came together. They joined one another and they created this movement. So these recommendations were ultimately adopted. And we stand on their shoulders because they were marching in the streets and calling for action in Warren County and around the nation. And these calls for action, whether they're in our formal listening session or in the NEJAC public listening session or out in the streets, they continue to be important drivers for change, and they continue to hold us accountable.
Brandon, I saw you nodding when Marion was talking. Thank you for that, Marion. What the ways to connect that the federal agencies are engaged in, and the ways that we can connect with those agencies? How do we do that? What are some of the ways that you suggest we engage jointly in the work? How do we find out what FEMA is doing around environmental justice?
Well, there are a lot of ways. So we now have a scorecard as a result of some of the Justice 40 initiatives that are online. FEMA falls under DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And so we can share the link so you can follow how many people are involved in climate justice and who's doing the work on the ground. But I think there are a few ways, because I've been inside and outside baseball with this type of conversation. And so through existing organizations, we have memorandums of understanding and memorandums of agreement with civil rights organizations, other organizations that help us to better understand what policy changes people want. So you can work inside through those organizations. You can also create your own organization. Latricia Adams with Millennials for Flint actually decided that she wanted to look into water and lead and create an organization of her own, which now she has the ability to work with us as we convene organizations to come in and have conversations. She's actually on one of the national councils at this point. But another way specifically for emergency management is to reach out to our regional offices. There's a regional office right there in Atlanta, to engage when a disaster happens and go to a disaster recovery center, have conversations with the staff there and figure out how your community can get engaged when disasters happen. But I will just give you a heads up that the best time to talk to us is before one happens, is to reach out to our community liaisons, get to know us, get to know me. I'm out here in California in Region 9. I heard some conversation about reparations out here. And we can help to connect you to not only the grant opportunities, but the information, where to go, so that community leaders can then create their own ways of communicating with the public about our processes in a way that are culturally sensitive, and really drive the points home to their communities in a way that we cannot. So I encourage you to engage with us in any way. You can reach out to me and I'll point you in the direction of those folks who can help you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Listen, if you're watching, pay attention to that, to what Marion shared, to what Brandy shared, because it's important that we connect, that we know what's happening with agencies, federal agencies, and that we see the work that's being done, but also if we need to see what's not being done so that we can connect. This is how government works. You know, that we're engaged and we're a part. It is we the people. Dr. Reams, as we close out this panel and we prepare to end our beloved community talks today, what are some ways that the Department of Energy is engaged in this struggle for environmental justice?
Yeah, so DOE is 100,000 federal employees, contractors, fellows strong. And so we're talking about a huge agency that has primarily been focused on research and development. And so engaging with communities, while not new for the department, is something we don't do often. And I think our office has really kind of helped in that effort. Unlike EPA and FEMA, we don't have regional offices. So we're primarily in DC. And so we have to leave DC and go out and meet communities where they are. And just last month, we launched what we call the Energy Justice to the People Tour. And this is where we will be touring around the country and visiting Black and Brown communities, other communities of color, low-income communities, to hear directly from people. Because what does it mean to get solar? What does it mean to buy an EV? What does it mean to do carbon capture and sequestration? You know, so really talking about the $62 billion in the infrastructure law and the $40 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act and some other multi-billion-dollar investment from the CHIPS and Science Act, all that your representatives in Congress passed, right, to actually bring about our clean energy revolution. But we want to make sure that that money just doesn't flow out here and people make lots of money on it, but that it actually goes to communities. And so we're doing our tour. The secretary is always out on the ground. The first leg of our tour went down to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. So we were along the Mexico border and learned about, you know, how a lot of our clean energy programs are in our tax code, and so many people in that area have no tax liability. And so immediately they're unable to benefit. And so what are the other programs that the department has that allows people to benefit? States are signing up to bring in industry to do hydrogen and carbon. And so what does that look like on the ground? And something that we've instituted is called a community benefits plan. So any applicant to the Department of Energy now will have to talk about how they're delivering benefits to the communities and wherever they're building their plant or their infrastructure, as well as how they're going to adhere to Justice 40, how they're going to have diverse project teams and how they're going to do community agreements and labor agreements. And so we're trying to integrate and institutionalize this idea of equity and justice into the main mechanism that we have, which is our funding opportunities. But I think it's also important for people to understand that a lot of the money in the Inflation Reduction Act is in the tax code, which means businesses can apply for those resources without going through the traditional application to departments. And so when we talked about what is government and how government works, there is a private sector element of government supported activities that will require citizens and community members to really go to their state. And so that those levels of government, I think, are really clear for us to have conversations about so people know who might be the right entity to talk to, because we hear a lot of things at the federal level that we have limited capacity to address. And so trying to direct people to their state and local governments, which I think the Atlanta conversation was so important because people need to know where actions and decisions are made. We also have a lot of stuff on our website, so we can share that with folks. One other thing I want to plug. So I talked about the $62 billion coming to DOE. People review those applications to decide who gets that money. And so we have something called merit review. We've been recruiting community members to be merit reviewers who can understand either if you got special skills in certain technologies, but also if you can review a plan to understand if this will have a benefit or harm to community. 20% of applications score is now devoted to this community benefits plan. And so 1/4 of an applicant's score is whether they benefit communities or not. And so we need people to review those plans And I can also share that information so people can sign up.
Thank you so much to each of you. Listen, audience, these things that Brandy and Marion and Dr. Reeves just shared about how we can be engaged, please, please, please rewatch this broadcast. Make note of those ways, from the mayor review to the citizen engagement models and the different initiatives that Brandy and Marion talked about. We want to be a part of the solution, but also these agencies are working on solutions. And we might not know all the ways that federal agencies are working. We need to find out and be engaged. Brandy, thank you so much for the work that you do with FEMA. Thank you for being from a community that you're invested in helping and growing. That's to go back and to see, I come from here, I can deposit something in. That's a powerful thing. Marion, thank you for the ways that you're elevating the work that EPA is doing with the civil rights issue. It is a civil rights issue, environmental justice. Thank you for your work. Dr. Reeves, thank you for what you do every day with the Department of Energy. We are, as the King Center, grateful for each of you, and we do look forward to continuing to engage you on our social media platforms and on panels in the future, which includes our beloved community global summit in January during King Holiday. I think we should revisit this conversation. So hopefully we can make plans for you to join us again. We're so grateful. Thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, as we close out, kind of summarize what's happened with the two panel discussions, we want to bring on our CEO, Dr. Bernice A. King, to conclude this beloved Community Talks virtual experience today. We have a global audience. That's why I'm saying today, maybe evening for you, maybe morning, maybe afternoon. So joining us now as we conclude this beloved Community Talks virtual experience, Dr. Bernice A. King.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. Hey, we're color coded. Check
it. Yes, we are.
Come on with the burgundy. All you needed was some pink glasses, King.
I had some, and I contemplated.
You had some,
but I decided not. I decided to tone it down a little bit.
Not me. Welcome to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for leading this conversation, and I want to thank all of our guest panelists for their time and their expertise in this much needed area. I often tell people I'm still learning as it relates to environmental issues, and I appreciate the expertise of the people around the King Center and continuing to push us in these areas that are part of, the challenges to creating the beloved community. These environmental issues are very serious. I think we should take them seriously. And there's much all of us have to do to learn and unpack so many things. But as everybody was talking, I have to tell you, there was the words from my father's last convention speech, the last SCLC convention speech in 1967. That speech was entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" Same as the book that he released that same year too, except the book was Chaos or Community. But he talked about two things that I think resonated with me tonight as we think about the subject matter of environmental racism. He talked about this curious formula that declares Blacks as 50% of a person, and he went on to talk about how it as Black people, we end up with 50% of the good and twice as much of the bad in this life. And as I was listening to the conversation, and we're talking about those people in positions of power in terms of our elected officials in particular, the decisions that they make, I kept hearing part of the issue. One is we don't we don't yet understand the importance of dignity and what that really looks like, and what it plays out, or how it should play out in a community, in a society, in a city, etc. And one day we need to talk about what is dignity. How does it show up? Because when you think about what's happening all across the nation environmentally, the issue that's happening here in our city related to the public safety training facility and the environmental threats and hazards, the bottom line is, the dignity of individuals can't just be confined to a narrow definition. We've got to expand our definitions. Like when we talk about public safety, for instance, for me, environmental issues are public safety issues, just as much as, gun violence, crime, and those things that we typically define as public safety issues. So expanding that definition. But more importantly, our leaders in making decisions have got to ground themselves in love. That same speech my father made, that's where he talked about, the relationship between power and
justice,
love.
and love.
Justice, and talked about how power without love is reckless and abusive. And that's what's happening. We're coming up with these very reckless and abusive policies because we are not grounded in love. And we don't understand the dignity, worth, and value of people, and looking out for the safeguarding and protection of people, their safety and well-being. And then he talked about how love without power is sentimental and anemic, and we know the rest of it. So I just wanted to bring those things into the discussion as we close out and continue this conversation over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. And I just, as we conclude, actually, as we're going out, to add to what Dr. King just shared, as we prepare for parts 2 and 3 of this series on environmental justice, just for us to think about what justice means, according to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
Exactly.
So as we consider that, as we close this conversation, these 2 conversations, and then conclude with what Dr. King just shared, we want you to, going into part 2, think about that definition for justice. As we talk about environmental justice, how there have been things that have disproportionately harmed, often intentionally, Black people, also Indigenous people, poor white people, brown people. How can we get to justice, which is not revenge or retaliation, but justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love? Think about that as you prepare to join us for part 2 next Tuesday. Also, we will be sharing resources, articles, videos on environmental racism and environmental justice. Join us on this journey as we learn together and as we create the beloved community. That's the vision of the King Center, the beloved community, where injustice ceases and love prevails. We can create that together. We believe it. Dr. King, as our CEO, believes it. I believe it. We believe it at the King Center, and we are grateful for you joining us as we do that work. Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you to each of our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. West.
We'll see you next week.